She stood knee-deep in the winter snow, clutching a trembling child behind her, as a monstrous rogue bared its yellowed fangs. Above them on the castle balcony, the Alpha King watched. He raised a hand, stopping his heavily armed guards. He wasn't going to save her. She was entirely on her own. The great hall of Winterguard was a cavern of rough-hewn stone, echoing with the raucous laughter of 100 different packs. It was the eve of the Blood Moon Summit, a medieval tradition where alliances were forged in blood and marriages were brokered over roasted boar and casks of dark ale. Tapestries depicting ancient wolf deities hung from the rafters, their woven eyes seeming to pass judgment on the wolves feasting below. For Gwendolen, the summit was just another stage for her daily torment. Born into the prestigious Ashdown Pack, Gwendolen was an anomaly that her kin wished they could erase. In a world where a wolf's worth was measured by the breadth of their shoulders and the lethality of their shifted form, she was painfully human. At 22, her wolf remained utterly silent, a dormant, unreachable spark. She was small, slender, and lacked the heightened senses or raw strength of her peers. To the Ashdown elites, she was the runt, a walking blemish on their proud aristocratic bloodline. "Watch your step, little human," a voice sneered. Gwendolen didn't even have time to brace herself before a heavy leather boot hooked her ankle. She pitched forward, the massive wooden tray of sloshing ale tankards she was carrying crashing to the cobblestone floor. The thick, malted liquor splashed across the hem of her coarse wool dress, soaking into her boots. Laughter erupted around her. Beatrice, a stunning, golden-haired she-wolf from the Highland Pack, stood over her, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. Beside her, Silas, an arrogant enforcer, nudged Gwendolen's fallen tray with his sword scabbard. "Still playing the servant, Gwendolen?" Beatrice mocked, her voice carrying over the din of the hall. "I suppose it's the only way you can make yourself useful. Since you can't hunt, you might as well clean up after those who do." Gwendolen kept her head bowed, her damp hair falling forward to hide the hot tears of humiliation pricking her eyes. She scrambled to gather the heavy pewter tankards, her hands raw and blistered from a week of forced labor. She didn't respond. Fighting back only ever resulted in worse beatings in the training yard, where accidents were easily excused. Suddenly, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the great hall. The laughter died in throats. The clattering of plates ceased. The sheer weight of the dominating aura pressing down on the room made even the fiercest alphas lower their gazes. King Aidan had entered. He was a terrifying vision of medieval regality. Draped in a cloak of black wolf fur clasped with heavy silver chains, Aidan was a towering figure forged from war and ruthlessness. His face was a landscape of harsh angles, marred by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from the northern rebellions. His eyes, a striking glacial blue, swept over the hall with the calculating coldness of an apex predator. He was the undisputed ruler of the realm, a king who had slaughtered his way to the throne to end a century of pack wars. As Aidan strode toward the high table, his royal guard trailing behind him in polished chainmail, his glacial gaze momentarily locked onto Gwendolen. She was still kneeling on the wet stone, clutching a dented tankard. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Gwendolen felt a jolt run through her chest, a strange, breathless tightening. She expected pity, or perhaps disgust, from the Alpha King. Instead, his expression remained entirely unreadable. It was a mask of cold stone. He didn't order Beatrice to back away. He didn't offer a hand. He simply turned his head, breaking the connection, and took his seat at the head of the high table, leaving Gwendolen to scrub the ale from the floor alone. The message was clear. In Winterguard, the weak were left to their own devices. Swallowing the bitter lump in her throat, Gwendolen finished her degrading task and slipped out the heavy oak doors of the great hall. The oppressive heat of the feasting room gave way to the biting, brutal chill of the midnight air. The castle courtyard was blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of iron brazier torches mounted on the stone walls. She needed firewood for the servants' quarters. Wrapping her thin, frayed shawl tighter around her shoulders, she trudged past the heavily armoured sentries guarding the inner keep, making her way toward the massive timber stacks near the outer perimeter, where the castle grounds met the ancient, looming tree line of the Blackwood Forest. The forest was notoriously dangerous. It was a haven for outlaws, exiles, and the worst kind of monsters, rogues, wolves who had lost their humanity, driven mad by isolation and bloodlust. But the perimeter was heavily warded and guarded by Aiden's elite soldiers, or so she thought. The wind howled through the battlements, carrying the scent of impending blizzard and pine. Gwendolen had just loaded her arms with heavy, frost-bitten logs when a small, muffled sound caught her attention. It was a whimper. She froze, dropping a log. Her human ears might not have been sharp, but the sound of a child in distress was unmistakable. She squinted into the gloom near the edge of the tree line, where the shadows of the ancient pines stretched like long, grasping fingers over the snow. There, wandering dangerously close to the deep woods, was a small figure wrapped in a rich velvet cloak. It was little Tobias, the 5-year-old son of Lord Frederick, one of the visiting Southern Alphas. The boy was sobbing quietly, chasing after a small, carved wooden horse that had tumbled down the snowy embankment toward the dark trees. "Tobias!" Gwendolen called out, keeping her voice low so as not to startle him. She dropped the rest of her firewood and hurried through the knee-deep snow. "Tobias, sweetie, you shouldn't be out here. It's freezing." The boy turned, his face red from the cold and tears. "My horsey," he sniffled, pointing into the dense thicket. "I'll get it," Gwendolen said, reaching him and instinctively pulling him behind her skirt. "But we need to go back inside immediately." Before she could take another step, the wind shifted. A vile, rancid stench hit Gwendolen like a physical blow, the smell of rotting meat, wet copper, and feral sickness. From the absolute darkness of the tree line, a nightmare emerged. It didn't walk like a wolf. It stalked like a deformed demon. It was a massive rogue, far larger than any normal shifted wolf. Its fur was matted with dried blood and filth, missing in large patches to reveal grey, scarred skin. One of its eyes was a milky, blind white, while the other burned with a crazed, ravenous yellow light. It slavered, thick drool freezing as it dripped onto the snow. Tobias let out a piercing, terrified shriek. "Guards!" Gwendolen screamed, her voice tearing through the freezing night. "Rogue! Guards, help!" She shoved Tobias hard behind a nearby stone pillar, putting herself directly between the child and the beast. She had no wolf to shift into. She had no claws, no fangs, no impenetrable hide. She was wearing a woolen dress and leather boots. Up on the high balcony overlooking the outer bailey, heavy wooden doors banged open. Torches flared as a dozen heavily armoured royal guards rushed to the stone railing, crossbows loaded and aimed. At their centre stood King Aiden, his black fur cloak whipping in the violent wind. Thank the goddess, Gwendolen thought, a sob of relief catching in her throat. They see us. They'll kill it. Fire! The captain of the guard yelled, raising his hand to signal the archers. Hold! The command cut through the howling wind like a steel blade. It was Aiden. Gwendolen stared up at the balcony in absolute disbelief. The archers lowered their weapons, looking at their king in confusion. Aidan stood at the edge of the parapet, his hands resting casually on the stone. His glacial blue eyes were locked directly on Gwendolen. He was watching her, studying her. "My king!" the captain protested. "The cub!" "I said hold your fire, Commander," Aidan ordered, his voice echoing with an unnatural, booming authority that commanded absolute obedience. "Let us see what the Ashdown runt is truly made of." A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Gwendolen, instantly replaced by a searing, explosive rage. He was using a child's life to test her. He was leaving her to die. The king of all wolves, the supposed protector of the realm, was treating this like a twisted gladiatorial spectacle. The rogue didn't care about the politics on the balcony. It let out a guttural, bone-rattling roar and charged, its massive paws tearing up chunks of frozen earth and snow. Gwendolen had no time to panic. Survival instinct, raw and purely human, kicked in. She lunged to the side, grabbing the heavy iron wood axe left behind by the servants near the timber stack. The handle was freezing, rough wood, but she gripped it with both hands just as the rogue leaped. The beast collided with her, the sheer force of the impact throwing her backward into the snow. The heavy axe flew from her hands. The rogue was on top of her in an instant, its jaws snapping inches from her face, its putrid breath choking her. Gwendolen screamed, bringing her forearms up, shoving them against the monster's throat to keep its fangs from tearing out her jugular. Its claws raked down her shoulder, tearing through the thick wool of her dress and sinking deep into her flesh. White-hot agony flared in her arm. Blood immediately soaked her sleeve, steaming in the freezing air. "Gwen!" Tobias cried out from behind the pillar. "Stay back!" she shrieked at the boy. The rogue's jaws snapped closer, its drool splashing onto her cheek. She was losing leverage. Her human strength was nothing compared to the monstrous weight crushing her ribs. She glanced frantically around. Her hand touched something buried in the snow, one of the thick, jagged logs she had dropped earlier. With a desperate cry, she blindly grabbed the log and slammed it brutally into the side of the rogue's head. The beast yelped, a momentary flash of shock breaking its assault. It rolled to the side, shaking its massive head. Gwendolen didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the agonizing, bleeding gashes on her shoulder. She dove for the nearest iron brazier torch. The metal pole was heavy, but she hoisted it up, the fire roaring at the end. The rogue recovered, its yellow eye narrowing with hateful, intelligent malice. It circled her, realizing its prey was not going to submit. Up on the balcony, the silence was deafening. The guards stood frozen, watching the brutal dance below. Beatrice and Silas had come out to watch, expecting to see the pathetic Gwendolen torn to ribbons. Yet, Aidan remained motionless, his eyes narrowed, missing absolutely nothing. Gwendolen stood between the rogue and the weeping child, gripping the burning iron torch like a spear. Her blood dripped steadily onto the white snow, staining it a brilliant, terrifying crimson. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. "Come on, you ugly bastard," she whispered, her voice trembling, but laced with a sudden, venomous grit she didn't know she possessed. The rogue lunged again, not aiming for a bite, but a sweeping claw strike meant to disembowel her. Gwendolen dropped to her knees, sliding beneath the arc of its massive arm. As the beast passed over her, she thrust the burning brazier upward, driving the red-hot iron and flaming coals directly into the rogue's soft underbelly. The stench of searing flesh and burning hair instantly filled the courtyard. The monster let out a deafening, agonizing shriek, thrashing wildly. A stray claw caught Gwendolen across the ribs, throwing her violently against the stone wall of the keep. Her vision swam. pain radiated from her side, and the taste of copper flooded her mouth. The torch had rolled away, sizzling as it died in the snow. Through her blurring vision, she saw the rogue recovering. The burn on its stomach had only enraged it further. It was no longer looking for a meal. It wanted revenge. It slowly stalked toward her, its fangs bared, preparing for the final, lethal strike. Gwendolen slumped against the icy stone. She had nothing left. No weapons. No strength. She looked up at the balcony one last time. Aidan was still there, a dark, imposing statue against the night sky. I will not die a coward, she thought, a strange, profound calm suddenly washing over her. I will not give him the satisfaction. As the monstrous rogue leaped into the air, jaws wide to tear her apart, Gwendolen closed her eyes and braced for death. But deep within her chest, in the darkest, forgotten corner of her soul, something ancient and terrible finally snapped awake. The rogue was suspended in the air, a mass of rotting muscle and lethal fangs descending toward Gwendolen's throat. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an excruciating crawl. The agonizing pain in her ribs, the searing tear in her shoulder, and the biting cold of the snow faded into white noise. In that infinitesimally small pocket of time between life and certain death, the dormant spark within Gwendolen ignited into a raging inferno. It didn't feel like the graceful, natural shifting process the other wolves described. It felt like a tectonic rupture. A sound like shattering glass echoed inside her skull, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated power that tasted like lightning and ancient copper. It wasn't just a wolf waking up. It was a primordial entity breaking out of a 22-year prison. A shockwave of sheer force blasted outward from Gwendolen's fragile human body. The rogue, mid-pounce, hit the invisible wall of energy and was hurled backward, crashing into the frozen timber stack with a sickening crunch of wood and bone. Up on the balcony, the mocking sneers of Beatrice and Silas vanished. King Aidan finally gripped the stone parapet, leaning forward, his icy blue eyes widening as the impossible unfolded in the courtyard below. A blinding, ethereal silver light engulfed Gwendolen. Her human screams twisted, dropping an octave, morphing into a terrifying, guttural roar that shook the very foundations of Winterguard Castle. Her bones snapped and elongated with sickening cracks that echoed through the bailey. But there was no pain, only an overwhelming, intoxicating rush of dominance. When the light snapped out of existence, Gwendolen was gone. Standing between the weeping Tobias and the recovering rogue was a monster of a completely different breed. She was not a standard pack wolf. She was massive, easily standing a foot taller at the shoulder than Aidan's largest elite guards. Her fur was a dazzling, unnatural shade of pure, iridescent silver that seemed to catch and magnify the moonlight. But it was her eyes that paralyzed the onlookers. They were pools of liquid, glowing amethyst, burning with an ancient royal fury. "Goddess above," whispered Lord Harrington, the alpha of the Ashdown pack, stepping out onto the balcony, his face drained of all color. "A Sterling, it's impossible. The bloodline was eradicated." Down in the snow, Gwendolen's wolf didn't care about pack politics or ancient law. Her amethyst eyes locked onto the rogue, which was pulling itself from the splintered logs, shaking its deformed head. The beast looked at the colossal silver wolf and, for the first time, hesitated. Its crazed yellow eye flashed with a flicker of pure, animalistic dread. Gwendolen didn't wait. The ground shuddered as she launched herself forward. The speed of the massive silver wolf was blinding, defying her sheer size. The rogue tried to swipe at her with its mangled claws, but Gwendolen ducked under the blow with supernatural agility. She slammed her massive shoulder into the beast's chest, the impact sounding like a battering ram hitting castle gates. The rogue's ribs shattered instantly. As it tumbled backward into the snow, Gwendolen was upon it. There was no honor in this fight. This was an execution. Her jaws, lined with teeth that looked more like polished sabers than wolf fangs, clamped down on the rogue's thick, matted neck. The beast thrashed, desperately clawing at her silver flanks, but her hide was impenetrable, woven with the ancient magic of a forgotten lineage. With one vicious, brutal snap of her head, the sound of breaking vertebrae cracked through the silent night. The rogue went entirely limp, its dark blood seeping into the pristine white snow. Gwendolen released the carcass, stepping over it. She turned her massive silver head back toward the stone pillar where little Tobias was hiding. The boy was staring at her, wide-eyed, trembling. Gwendolen let out a low, rumbling huff that sounded almost like a purr. She lowered her massive head to the snow, nudging the small, carved wooden horse toward the boy with her nose. Tobias slowly reached out, his tiny hand brushing her silver muzzle before he grabbed his toy. "Thank you," he whispered. Satisfied the cub was safe, Gwendolen turned her gaze upward. Her amethyst eyes locked onto the balcony, piercing straight through the darkness to meet King Aidan's glacial blue stare. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Then, the adrenaline vanished. The sheer, overwhelming toll of the transformation and the blood loss from her human wounds caught up with her. The silver wolf swayed, letting out a soft, pained whimper before collapsing into the snow. The silver light flared once more, and she shifted back into her human form, lying naked, bruised and bleeding on the frozen earth. Chaos erupted on the balcony. "Get the healers!" Lord Frederick roared, rushing for the stairs to reach his son. But King Aidan was already moving. He didn't take the stairs. Vaulting over the stone parapet, the Alpha King dropped 20 feet into the courtyard, landing heavily but gracefully in the snow, his thick black fur cloak billowing around him. He didn't spare a single glance for the dead rogue or the royal guards pouring out of the keep. He strode directly to Gwendolen. Kneeling beside her unconscious body, his typically stoic face tightened. The deep, jagged claw marks on her shoulder were bleeding sluggishly, and her skin was pale as marble. Without a word, he unclasped his heavy, royal cloak, the symbol of his absolute authority over the realm, and wrapped it gently around her shivering, broken form. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her against his chest. "Put her down, Aidan," a voice barked. Lord Harrington, the alpha of the Ashdown pack, marched into the courtyard, flanked by his enforcers, Silas and Beatrice. Harrington's eyes were locked on Gwendolen with a mixture of terror and greedy calculation. "She is of the Ashdown pack," Harrington demanded, puffing out his chest to project authority he did not truly feel. "She is my subject. You will hand her over to my healers immediately. If she is a true sterling Lycan, her place is with her pack." Aidan stopped. He didn't turn around right away. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. When the king finally turned to face Harrington, his glacial eyes promised absolute violence. "Your subject." Aidan's voice was dangerously quiet, a lethal purr that echoed off the castle walls. "For 22 years, you allowed the heir of the Sterling lineage to scrub your floors. You allowed your pack to beat her, starve her, and mock her as a runt. You treated a queen like a feral dog." Beatrice shrank back, her arrogant smirk entirely erased, hiding behind Silas. "We didn't know," Harrington stammered, his bravado crumbling under the king's crushing aura. "Her wolf was sealed. There was no scent, no sign." "Because her mother, Lady Genevieve of the House of Lancaster," placed a blood seal on her the night the Sterling pack was massacred, Aidan cut in, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. A seal so deep it would only break under the most extreme, desperate circumstance. A seal that required her to face certain death not for herself, but to protect the innocent. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of nobles and guards. The pieces were clicking into place. "You knew," Silas whispered, staring at the king in horror. "You knew what she was. That's why you didn't let the archers fire. You used the boy. You used the rogue." "I did what was necessary," Aidan said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, daring any of them to challenge his morality. "I spent 5 years searching for the lost Sterling heir. When my spies found her in your miserable pack, Harrington, I knew simply claiming her wouldn't work. Her wolf was locked away in a trauma-induced coma. She needed a catalyst. She needed to choose to fight." He looked down at Gwendolen, brushing a stray, blood-matted lock of hair from her pale cheek. For the first time, the harsh angles of his scarred face softened. "She possessed more courage as a powerless human than any of you possess with all your fangs and claws," Aidan declared, his voice booming across the courtyard. "She stood alone against a nightmare to save a child that wasn't hers, while you all watched from the safety of my walls." He locked eyes with Harrington. "Gwendolen is no longer of Ashdown. You have forfeited any right to her. If you, or any of your pack, so much as speak her name without permission, I will personally mount your heads on the gates of Winterguard. Do we understand each other, Harrington?" Harrington dropped to his knees in the snow, baring his neck in absolute submission. "Yes, my king." Aidan turned his back on the cowering Alpha. He carried Gwendolen through the parting sea of royal guards, heading straight for the massive iron doors of the inner keep. He carried her past the whispering nobles, past the bloodstains, and into the warmth of the castle. Hours later, in the king's private chambers, the fire crackled in the massive stone hearth. Gwendolen slowly opened her eyes. The scent of pine, winter, and overwhelming, protective power filled her senses. She wasn't in the servants' quarters. She was lying in a massive, velvet-draped bed, her wounds meticulously cleaned and bound in white linen. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair beside the bed was Aidan. He had removed his armor, wearing only a simple dark tunic. He looked exhausted, the shadows deep beneath his striking eyes. "You're awake," he said quietly. Gwendolen tried to sit up, a wince escaping her lips as her ribs protested. The memories of the night flooded back, the rogue, the terror, the explosive, violent birth of the Silver Wolf. She looked at Aidan, her chest tightening, with a complex knot of anger and an undeniable magnetic pull. "You left me to die," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I left you to live," Aidan corrected gently, leaning forward. "If I had saved you, you would have remained a prisoner in your own body, subjugated by Ashdown for the rest of your life. I couldn't allow that. Not for my mate." Gwendolen froze. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "Mate. The moment you walked into the Great Hall," Aidan continued, his gaze dropping to her hands, "my wolf recognized yours, even sealed away. I felt your pain, Gwendolen, every ounce of it. It took every shred of my willpower not to slaughter Beatrice and Silas on the spot. But I knew the law. I knew the only way to free the Sterling Wolf was to push you to the absolute brink." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers. "I am sorry for the terror I put you through. But I am not sorry for the result. You are a queen by blood, Gwendolen. And now, you are a queen in truth." She looked into his eyes, seeing the ruthless king who had gambled her life. but also the mate who had given her the ultimate freedom to claim her own power. She squeezed his hand back, a small, weary but victorious smile touching her lips. The runt of Ashdown was dead. The Silver Queen of Winterguard had arrived. Gwendolen's ascent from a mocked outcast to the Silver Queen of Winterguard shattered the medieval hierarchy. By forcing her to confront death, Aidan unlocked a primordial power that mere coddling never could have unearthed. Together, the Scarred King and the Silver Lycan ruled a united realm, proving that true strength isn't born from nobility or an easy life, but forged in the unforgiving fires of survival and sacrifice.